Good morning. It's the kind of gospel lesson that'll make a preacher glad that we're in a sermon series. I'll tell you what. We are indeed in a sermon series. This is week 2. Last week, we started to enter into a conversation about restoring our connection to the things in our lives that are most important. Last week, we discussed the reconnection or restoring of our connection to faith itself, returning to our sense of trust and the promises of God, those promises that we hope for, and our trust in God's ability to help deliver those promises, make them a reality. And so I'm sure all of you remember that great line from the book of Hebrews that we read last week, that faith or trust is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence or confidence in things not yet seen. We participate with our hope, the very substance of our hope, these promises. And in the participation of them, we witness to the world that God is creating, even while we are waiting for it to be created sometimes. Last week, this 2,000-year-old sermon that we're reading called Hebrews gave us the example of the human family, Abraham and Sarah, as a way of understanding how it looks when we consider the actions of God and participate in the promises of God even while we're waiting. Well, the preacher didn't stop there. And so today we get a little bit of a continuation of all these other stories about people who responded to God with faithfulness even while they were waiting. I'm sure you knew who all those people were that you read about, right? All the stories of Gideon and Jephthah. You know Jephthah, don't you? Right? And Rahab. Some of y'all know Rahab, right? Some of you? We've got these stories. They are great stories, and I would encourage you to go back and look at them sometime, but it really wasn't the point. The preacher knew that everybody knew the stories in the original context, and so the key was, look at all these people who were all flawed, by the way, in their own way, but who followed God by participating in the things of faith, by trusting. These were not the only ones. The ones we remember by name, the ones that we tell stories about in Sunday school classes, but there were a lot of others whose names we don't remember, and their lives were incredibly difficult. These saints who have gone before us, beaten and tortured and killed by lions and sawn in half and so on and so forth. Whew. I totally understand where the preacher was getting. We're getting close to the end of the sermon. He probably lost it a little bit. You can see the kids squirming when he said sawn in two. But you have to remember that the real purpose of the sermon was to encourage us to live by faith. So we look back to these ones who have gone before us, who have run this race, who have caught glimpses of the finish line, but who didn't make it to the finish line already. And we understand that we're like them, running this race, aiming for this finish line that we haven't really made it to yet, and some of us are tired. And so the preacher says, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, all those people who've come before us and all these people surrounding us now, let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. In other words, yeah, sometimes your faith alone, your individual faith, it's not going to be enough. Sometimes you're going to be too tired. It won't be enough for you to make it to that finish line at all, but fear not, because you are never running alone. Christian community is an incredibly important part, an aspect of our faith and our practice, at least when it's done well. I mean, I should put an asterisk on this and say sometimes we see what it looks like when it goes poorly, right? Christian communities that mimic the other communities in this world that default back to tribalism or exclusion or shame production or something like that. The trick of this whole cloud of witnesses thing is that we, too, sometimes are flawed in those ways and other ways, too. If we took a little straw poll, many of us would raise our hands and say, yeah, we've known churches that cause harm. We have those stories. But we also have stories of a church that witnesses well to the things we are hoping for. When done well, the Christian community is a powerful witness to the movement of God's love in this world. Remember how we were talking about that our faith is our participation in the thing we're hoping for? Well, some of the things that we're hoping for is like a world of grace and a world of justice and a world of love and a world of mercy and so on and so forth. And so we have seen when people act merciful when they don't have to, or loving when they don't have to. We've seen people participating together in a hope for a world that is filled with God's love, unconditional, sacrificial, even while we're waiting for it to be true for everybody, even when our legs and our knees get tired of running this race, waiting for it to happen. And we've seen people participating in a hope for a world that's filled with grace that is given freely and completely, without expectation of any kind of favor in return. And we've seen what it looks like when people participate in a hope for a world in which there is peace, that wholeness that comes in spite of our deep grief or experience of violence in this world. We've seen what it looks like when people participate in the embodiment of justice, even while we're waiting for a world in which people are truly reconciled to each other, truly reconciled. Part of what it means for us to be in Christian community together on this side of the finish line is struggling together, striving together to make it to the line, running the race together. We're imperfect, but we're trying. And we participate in small ways and in large ways in the world that God is restoring to us. Like we said last week, this action, this behavior, this stuff that we want to reconnect to, it's a choice. It's a choice to reconnect to Christian community. It's a choice. And that choice allows us to resist isolation. Isolation sits at the far end of the spectrum from community, right? We're built for community. Another sermon, perhaps someday, by the way, I'll mention that there is a distinct difference between isolation and solitude. Those of you who are introverts out there like me, solitude's okay. I'm not telling you that you have to be in community and talking to people all the time. That's not what church is about. The community is what church is all about. For now, we'll just say that haven't we learned a lot in the last few years about the damage that comes from isolation? We've known it for a long time, but there's such a distinct correlation between negative health outcomes, risks associated with social isolation, increased anxiety, increased depression, higher likelihood of death itself. To choose community over isolation is to choose life. And to ensure that this community is open and accessible and inclusive of all people is to promote life and welfare among all of God's children. To choose community over isolation helps us to choose life for ourselves as well, but in a way that moves us out of selfishness, helps us to center other people. The natural inclination of a lot of us, and maybe I'm just preaching to myself right now, is toward the self. Like, I've got an inner 2-year-old that puts my own actual 2-year-old to shame all the time. He's like, mine. I'm like, no, man, mine. We have this impulse in us that moves us in that way, but here's the thing, like any relationship, true communities of love will pull us out of self and toward other. We've said it before, and I'll say it over and over and over again until I hear it coming back from all of us. To love another person requires sacrifice. Requires it. It's a mandate. You cannot love another person without choosing to let go of yourself in favor of them from time to time. It requires sacrifice. It's a demand of love. It requires choosing another's interests over your own. Jesus taught us that. When we choose to act on love in a community, well, that's when the magic happens. And so here we are, wrestling with our own selfishness so that we can be together. And what the author of Hebrews would underline for us is this, that to choose to be in community altogether, to give and receive belonging with one another instead of isolation, is the source of our distinct strength. The endurance with which we run the race that is set before us, especially when the race gets hard. That's when Christian community shines. As a parable, I want to tell you a little bit about the sport of triathlon, something I enjoy watching, but not so much doing. Triathlon produces these really memorable finishes to races, right? These are people who have, especially if you look at something like an Ironman triathlon, been out there for hours, swimming forever, and then biking forever, and then running forever. And often in situations that are challenging from an environmental perspective. It's pretty amazing. You can sometimes see at the finish line that their muscles and blood have run out of glycogen, and they're dehydrated, and they're just exhausted, and they literally sometimes don't make it to the finish line. It's like they hit a wall, an invisible wall, before they make it there, and their knees just give out. That happens every now and then. Even on shorter courses from time to time, it happens. About 6 years ago, there was one of these cases. There are two brothers from Great Britain, the Brownlee brothers, and they are at the top of the world in terms of world triathlon. And the World Triathlon Championships were taking place in Cozumel, Mexico, and it was hot. And Johnny Brownlee looked like he was going to win, but he also looked like a guy from Great Britain that was running for hours in Cozumel, Mexico. And it wasn't looking good there at the end, and so all of a sudden, things didn't go well. I'm going to demonstrate for you. I did this at 9. He is like taking off. Sorry, camera operators. He's taking off. And he comes around this corner right at the end, and all of a sudden, as he's running around this last corner, his legs just start doing this weird thing. And the announcers are like, oh, Johnny looks like he's in trouble. Understatement. You wouldn't believe the understatement. Johnny looks like he's about to die. And he comes around this last corner, and instead of heading toward the finish line, he just starts leaning over and runs into the crowd, basically right up against the guardrail. Now, on his heels are two other runners, a guy from South Africa and Johnny's brother, Alistair Brownlee. Alistair Brownlee looks great. He also a British guy running in Cozumel, but he looks strong. Could have flown right by and probably out-sprinted the guy from South Africa and won the race. World championship, right? That opportunity is not going to come along every year. When he rounds that last corner, all of a sudden he slows down, he stops. The guy from South Africa runs on ahead. Alistair Brownlee comes up and kind of scoops up underneath his brother, gets his brother's arm around his shoulder and grabs his left hip, because otherwise the guy was going to keep on running in circles probably. Grabs his left hip, and the two of them jog across the finish line. Although they don't exactly, I'm sorry, I'm excited. Don't exactly jog across the finish line. When they get to the finish line, Alistair, who knows that he could have probably won and was guaranteed second place if he wanted it, gets there, and he kind of lets his brother go across the finish line first, which looks like this violent shove because the guy's legs don't work anymore. So as soon as he lets him go, he just face plants straight down. Anyway, that's an aside. The announcers who were like, Johnny looks like he's in trouble. The announcers also say, this is ridiculous. We've never seen such a display of brotherly love. And they meant that literally, of course. What sportsmanship? Sure. What love, they end up saying. That this one would sacrifice a prize purse and a this and a that, a place, prestige, fame, so that he could support his brother and help him cross that line. It's a parable for Christian community, because sometimes we are the runners whose legs are giving out at the last minute. Finish line is in view. But golly, I just can't run anymore. That's some of you today. Isolation just leaves you in that place. Christianity is not an individual sport. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Some of them are in the crowd that your body just keeps leaning toward while you're trying to run. That's okay. They're cheering you on. Some of them are running right next to you, and when their legs feel strong, they will pick you up and carry you the rest of the way. And one day, they might not be up for the race themselves and will depend on you. That's how it works. This is a parable of Christian community. Of course, it is Jesus who comes back across the finish line, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, and grabs a hold of all of us, isn't it? Otherwise, we'd all end up like Johnny Brownlee collapsing before the finish line, but this community is an embodiment of Christ's own love. And so before we ever make it to the finish line to begin with, before we ever grab a hold of that tape, God has chosen to bring us all across the line together. It's a real important distinction that Hebrews makes about all these people who have gone before us, these saints in light. That their goal wasn't to make it across the finish line anyway, but to run together, because it is God's goal for the unfolding of perfect love that we all will walk across that line together, hand in hand and arm, all of us holding each other and each of us being carried by God himself. So our job is to run on with perseverance the race that is set before us, generation by generation, friend by friend, heart by heart, each of you grabbing a hold of the other when you need it, and running the race with perseverance toward God's perfect love. As we do that together, and as we understand that to be the goal, not to beat somebody else to the finish line, but to help each other run the race, that's when we begin to witness to our hope in community for the thing that God is doing with us. When we restore our connection to true community, that's when we bear witness to our hope and participate in it. For love that does not isolate or exclude, doesn't promote one over the other, but brings us all together for the sake of him who died for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Now I invite you to stand as you are able as we profess our faith together in the words of the Nicene.